Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge that this webinar is hosted on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video or audio input from the audience. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Amy, and I'm the Communications Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute, ACRI, at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are joined by panelists Dr. Ming-Lu Chen, the Honourable Warwick Smith, and Mr. Wang Feng to reflect on the impact that developments in the bilateral relationship have had in 2021 and discuss the challenges in the year ahead. UTS ACRI Director Professor James Lawrenson will be moderating this panel discussion. Audience questions are welcome at the end, so please remember to submit your questions using the Q&A tab along the bottom panel of this Zoom webinar. Now a little bit about the speakers. Dr. Ming-Lu Chen is a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. Her research concentrates on social and political changes in China, especially the interaction between entrepreneurs and the state and women's political participation. The Honourable Warwick Smith is Chairman of the Advisory Board at Australian Capital Equity. He is also the Chairman of the National Museum of Australia. With Rio Tinto, he is a China Advisory Panel member and a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. At the Business Council of Australia, he is the Chairman of the Global Engagement Committee. He has served as the Chairman of the Australia-China Council for over 8 years and was the inaugural Chair of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. Mr. Wang Feng has worked for the Financial Times as Editor-in-Chief of ftchinese.com since April 2015. Previously, he was the editor of the online section of the South China Morning Post. He was the founding editor of the Chinese language financial news site of Reuters and editor-in-charge of Reuters' Chinese news service. He also worked as a journalist for various Chinese news organizations, including Caijing magazine in Beijing. Welcome to all our panelists. Our moderator for today's discussion is UTS ACRI Director Professor James Lawrenson. He has previously held appointments at the University of Queensland and Shandong University. Professor Lawrenson provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic relationship. I will now hand it over to Professor James Lawrenson to begin today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Amy. What a fabulous panel we've got with us today. Look, it's become somewhat of a tradition for ACRI to host an event coinciding with Chinese New Year that focuses on the big picture issues of the year that has just passed and the one that awaits for China, but for ACRI's purposes, even more specifically, the Australia-China relationship. And to do this, we like to pull together a group of experts with diverse backgrounds and experience. And as you've just heard from Amy, today's event is no exception. But before we launch into the panel discussion, I'd like to set the scene for 5 minutes. And as part of that, can I just recommend two recent ACRI publications to our audience. The first is this one by Rowan Kallick. Rowan's a well-known former Australian correspondent in China, now an industry professor at Griffith University, and I'm very happy to say also a member of the ACRI Advisory Board. What Rowan's provided is a really masterful overview of what's on Beijing's dance card in 2022. That's available on our website. And the second piece I'd like to recommend is just one that we released last night, authored by my colleague Eleanor Collinson. That's a wrap of the Australia-China relationship over the December-January period. Now, Eleanor has that wonderful gift of being able to find a speech or a quote that everyone else has missed. So I'd really encourage you to have a read of this. Eleanor produces this every month. If that's the only thing you read each month, that is what will keep you up to date with developments in the Australia-China relationship. Both are available on our website. Look, China's year, of course, particularly when viewed from Beijing, will be dominated by the 2 sessions of the National People's Congress in March, and even more importantly, from Beijing's perspective, the 20th Party Congress later in the year. That's the one where it seems inevitable, perhaps not inevitable, but almost inevitable, that Xi Jinping will be formally handed a third term as president, breaking the 2-term limit adhered to by his predecessors Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. And this year is also a big one for Australia-China relations. At least on paper, it's the 50th anniversary of the establishment of formal diplomatic relations. And yet, rather than a celebration between Canberra and Beijing, it's the general consensus that the official relationship is in its worst state since 1972. In fact, a recent ACRI research brief that we released just last week documented that while plenty of countries in our region are having increased challenges in their relations with China, Australia is an outlier. There's no other way of putting it in the state of its diplomatic engagement. And interaction between political representatives on both sides has not taken place since November 2019. There is no other country close to being in that position. And aside from diplomatic estrangement, of course, there continues to be many other areas of concern. Around a dozen Australian exports have been hit with disruption with no let-up. Even more concerning to Australians, Yang Hengjun and Cheng Lei remain held in China, accused of threatening national security, facing a grim outlook. Yang Hengjun has been held for 3 years now without a verdict. Cheng Lei remains detained and it hasn't even gone to trial. So not surprisingly, Australia's Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, regularly puts out statements. Let's not forget about these 2 Australians and this precarious situation that they find themselves in. No wonder that a majority of Australians, according to polling we did last year, 62%, said that their view of China since the start of 2020 had turned more negative. Now, look, at the same time, and I'm not trying to do a look over there type sketch here, it's just a fact that you can point to other aspects of the bilateral relationship that are actually going really quite well. For example, just one I looked up this morning, based on new data released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in aggregate, last year, 2-way trade between Australia and China hit a record high. Exports reached 177 billion, up 21% on a year earlier, and imports hit 91 billion, up 8%. It's also a fact that I think Australians, and perhaps many Chinese, are also more nuanced in their perspectives of the bilateral relationship than some of the simplistic lines that often come out of Canberra and Beijing. For example, according to our polling, 76% of Australians express mistrust of the Chinese government. Now, Canberra might like that, Beijing may not, but here's the thing. Here's something that Canberra may not be so happy with. Just 32% of Australians say the Australian government is managing the relationship with China well. And get this, 80% of Australians say that the responsibility for improving the relationship between Australia and China lies with both countries. Now, you're not going to get that nuance if you listen to what Canberra is saying, or on the other hand, what Beijing is saying. It's also a fact that China's the dominant resident power in Asia, the part of the world closest to Australia. So what that means is whether it's economic, strategic, or a national security issue for Australia, China looms large and it's not going to go away. So to summarise all that, I guess my basic point is that Australia's relationship with China is complex, it's multifaceted, it defies simplistic narratives and slogans, and that's why I'm very grateful that we've got a fabulous panel of experts to discuss these big picture issues with us today. Look, let's start with China. And I think pretty much anyone will tell you, if you're going to talk about China, you've got to start with the politics. So, Dr. Chen, I'd like to kick things off with you. The basic question I'd like to start with is this one. What does our audience today need to know about the forces that are driving the practice of politics in China in 2022? A common view I hear is that Xi Jinping is a true believer in Marxist-Leninist ideology and sees himself and the country as a whole in an extended struggle with hostile foreign forces that are driven by a different ideology and different geopolitical objectives. Thus, in contrast to whatever President Xi might say at Davos, fundamentally he views the world and China's place in it in zero-sum terms. The result is that under Xi, China's political system has tilted towards generating policies that support greater party and state control of business and society, your area of expertise, more centralisation of power and more emphasis on self-reliance rather than international connections. Dr. Chen, is that sufficient? Or do you see alternative or adjacent frames that are needed for understanding Chinese politics today, and why?
Thank you, James. That was a really good question. I agree with you that China-Australia relationship is a complexity, and it defies a simplistic narrative. I think when it comes to Chinese politics, it's the same. Right? It's also a complexity, which also defies a simplistic narrative. Even though I'm trying to kind of probably put forward a very simplistic framework for everyone here to understand not just what drives potential changes in Chinese politics in 2022, but really this is what I think the underlying theme which helps us to understand any kind of changes in China since 1949 until now and in its near future as well. I think is really this one thing, which is the Chinese Communist Party's effort to stay in power and to justify its legitimacy, its right to rule. So let me just elaborate on this a little bit. I think it really, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party has an overwhelming control of coercion, right? But I think in order for it to rule in an efficient, convincing way, coercive force is not enough. It's always expensive, it's very difficult and ineffective. So even for an authoritarian system like the Chinese Communist Party party state, legitimacy is very important because it would enhance the Chinese Communist Party's rule at a very low cost because it would generate this obedience and compliance from its citizens. So it makes any policy implementation and promotion very easy and straightforward. So I think if we adopt this framework, all the things you mentioned just now, things like this power centralization or decentralization, in its foreign policy making, the preference of self-reliance versus international cooperation, ideological change, and also a lot of other things, right? Emphasis on economic reform at a certain stage, emphasis on people's livelihood at some other stage, and the recent emphasis on a very grand nationalistic project, like national rejuvenation. I think all these things, if we put on this lens of this is an effort of the Chinese Communist Party trying to stay in power and trying to justify its right to rule, I think all this makes sense. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Chen. So what our audience and myself needs to keep in mind that fundamentally the issue is the Chinese Communist Party's desire and will to stay in power. And as you said, to get that legitimacy, coercion, it's not all about coercion. It must deliver on other fronts as well. I think you mentioned rising living standards and so on. Okay, so it's not just a simple story there in terms of how it maintains its legitimacy. Wang Feng, I might go to you next. Put a similar question to you. You're in Hong Kong. which is a place many international observers point to as Exhibit A for the interpretation of Chinese politics that I referred to earlier, one that's more ideological, one that's more controlling. The national security law and so on. How do you think we should be reading Beijing nowadays? I always like asking this question of people who aren't in Australia. I think it's very easy for whichever country you're in to find yourself in a bit of a bubble. So I'd like that to put that question to you. I mean, you could argue that some of the policy narratives and specific steps being taken by Beijing, whether dual circulation or common prosperity, phrases that many of our audience would have heard of, or even tighter controls being placed on tech platforms and so on, actually have a pretty strong pragmatic element. Right? It may not be all about coercion. I mean, plenty of liberal democracies are taking a close look at big tech too. Maybe the difference is that Beijing is just doing something about it, even if sometimes the steps taken might seem a bit clumsy and rough around the edges. So, Wangfeng, how do you see that balance of ideology and pragmatism in Beijing today? Or in fact, have I posed the question in error by holding those two up, ideology and pragmatism, as somehow two opposites, when in fact you might have a different view?
Right, thanks a lot. I very much appreciate your comments earlier and Dr. Chan's comments about, don't ever approach China or any other country through a simplistic, unipolar view or a simplistic political interpretation. I think the Communist Party, if not for anything else, up until 10 years ago, was very well known for its pragmatism in a lot of its policies. In these last 10 years, probably at least appears to the outside less pragmatic, more ideological, more doctrine-based. But still, let's take China's relations with Australia. In the last few years, as an example, I think even Beijing realizes the traditional approach of punishing, economic punishment or retaliation has its limits, and that's why, as you just mentioned, bilateral trade reached a new high, even amid this more than chilly relationship. So domestic policies like dual circulation or common prosperity also. To the outside, it might look like, yeah, she is really a firm believer of communist ideals. For example, in this day of age, taking such pains to correct huge parts of actually even national pillars of the economy just for the sake of common prosperity. But this point has been meticulously debated in the last year between economists and journalists and think tank researchers. How much of it is out of a pragmatic view of how to improve people's living standards for the long term? How much of it is based on his personal belief that China has strayed in its path, in its pursuit of communist or socialist ideals? I think there's probably more that people don't realize about the pragmatic sides of these policies. As many veteran China economic researchers have pointed out, you can find clues to a lot of the policies dating as far back as 10, 15 years ago, when Xi hadn't really climbed to the top of the power ladder yet. Indeed, he has had some of these views for a long time, but he's also constantly adjusting, or senior bureaucrats, government officials are helping him constantly adjust the fine details of these policies. So it's a very complex picture. The next directions of these policies will be based on a lot of factors, including external and domestic feedback. So it's not just one ever powerful leader doggedly pursuing his long held beliefs. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah, thanks, Wangfeng. So 2 points you mentioned there that really stood out to me. One is that you mentioned it's not all about Xi, and I think this is important to keep in mind, because it is very easy at least sitting in Australia, to get the impression that all the changes in China, it's all about Xi, when in fact, as you said, you can actually see, moves in these directions from Hu Jintao, who was occupying the presidency the 10 years before Xi. And also that some pragmatism remains. I think, just off the top of my head, I think of an example of that would be the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, I remember going to Beijing in April 2019, which was the second Belt and Road Forum. And I was actually quite struck by just how much of the feedback around the Belt and Road that China had heard and was taking on board. And I think I can see some evidence that some of that's been incorporated. I mean, I'm not saying, Beijing's operating the Belt and Road in a way that Washington or Canberra would be delighted with. But that ability to adjust, I think you're quite correct in pointing that out. So thank you for doing that. Warwick, I might head to you next and move away from China more towards Australia. The first question I'd like to put to you, Warwick, is this: as you listen to speeches by government ministers, you pass policy moves by the Morrison government, how do you think China is being viewed in our national capital, which is then feeding into how the Australian government responds? A bit of background to that question. Last year at this event, I asked Richard Maud, who was a former senior DFAT official, the chief drafter of Australia's 2017 foreign policy white paper, whether China's more recent behaviour, like its strikes on Australia's exports, would have confirmed in the minds of those in Canberra that a less sentimental view of China, the tougher line that's been taken to 2016 was the right call. He thought that was most likely to be the case. Now, when Morrison became PM, he talked, I remember particularly pointing plenty of people to this. He talked about his admiration for the John Howard approach to China relations, essentially a pragmatic approach, setting aside differences and focusing on working together in areas of mutual interest. But what I'm struck by, and push back if you think I've got this wrong, please do. But what it appears to me is that there has been a distinct shift in Morrison's own framing of China and the international system since, say, early 2020, to one that is actually less John Howard-like and more ideological and binary. This is, in fact, the point the political commentator Paul Kelly makes in a new essay, and he suggests it's a deep-seated position held by Morrison. I struggle with that. For example, in October 2019, at the Lowy Institute, Morrison said this, let me quote so I get the quote right, quote, "If you look at the rise of China as some great ideological struggle between two worldviews, well, that can take you to a dangerous end. And I don't subscribe to that analysis. I don't think it's in Australia's interest," close quotes. That's our Prime Minister speaking. And yet, in the middle of last year, and even more so over the last few months, for example, he gave a speech in the middle of last year at the Perth US Asia Centre, where he talked about needing to build, let me quote, "a world order that favours freedom over autocracy and authoritarianism." He said, quote, "Our challenge is nothing less than to reinforce, renovate and buttress a world order that favours freedom." Warwick, that sounds pretty ideological, pretty binary to me, with China very much being the other. What's your reading?
Well, firstly, James, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be along today with my fellow panellists. And I would pay credit to Rowan and Eleanor. I read Eleanor's piece earlier today. Essential reading, I agree. And Rowan, of course, I know very, very well for a long, long time, even from his Papua New Guinea days. So you bring a great deal of scholarship and credit to the China discussions and broader Australian discussions in all that you do at UTS. So thank you very much, and delighted to be here representing more broadly business. James, you look, I think you're right. The Prime Minister has changed. Most of those speeches, I think only one I missed, and which was the last one in Perth. One could attend on Zoom, but physically you can't get anywhere in Australia for 2 years. But and the beginning speech back in 2019 was what I would call wrapped around pragmatism and realism, and what had worked for quite a long period of time was the John Howard approach, and that had a bipartisan support. That approach, as we furthered all our trade arrangements, not just with China, but in North Asia, particularly through the Abbott years. And Gillard did her piece, and Rudd did some significant things that started to change a bit under Turnbull. But Morrison started his prime ministership by inheriting largely the ministry of Turnbull, and he still has the same foreign minister who was defence, but all appointed by Turnbull. So there's a continuity there, but is there continuity in the approach? And that's the essence of your question. My sense is it has changed. The geopolitical fault lines, colleagues, is here with us today. Blinken arrives today, the Secretary of State, highest American official here so far of this administration, for an enhanced focus on the Quad with Japan and India, foreign ministers. We had the Lithuanian foreign minister here yesterday to open an embassy, but that was more about what's happening in Russia. We've had dramatic meetings over a boycotted Winter Olympics, where we're one of only few, but China and Russia are combining. So basically, the world has changed a little bit, and the difficulty that Western democracies, in its widest sense, see about the emerging capability and economic capability of authoritarian regimes, largely China and Russia getting closer. There's come about a different approach, and that's reflected in that language. But what does it actually mean politically for Australia? The political parties here aren't all that different in the broader sense. They want legitimacy and they want to get re-elected. We have elections that is a test of legitimacy. Chinese have a different system, and that's why Mr. Wang's comment, it's not just all the leader in China, there's other issues at play. So we go into, I don't know, pick a date, the 14th of May or the 21st of May, after a March 31st budget. A couple of days thereafter, I suspect that we'll be heading off to the political polls to test the legitimacy of the language. But is there any difference between the two major parties? There's not a lot of difference. We can explore that, but there's not a lot of difference. And so both parties have changed. I think I spent a lot of time last week with the one-on-one with the opposition leader, and later in the week with the Prime Minister. There's not a lot of difference, really, on China. There might be some wedging going on, some sledging going on. After 22 years having left Canberra, I find that you become much more mature about matters of public issue and public policy and international relations. It's a near and how and urgent business these days in politics. It's on an hourly cycle that you don't often have time to reflect. So we do get some sloganeering and some unhelpful comment from time to time. But the bigger picture, I see it is some commonality between both major parties as they march into the election for a whole range of reasons, which we can explore. So, yes, it's become a sharper issue, but that's because the geopolitical fault lines have changed dramatically, James, certainly since 2019. And so the Howard prescription, as good as it was, and I'm part of that, it's changed.
Thanks, Warwick. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with change, right? I mean, the world changes, so the Australian government has to change with it. I guess I'm just struck by a line I often hear from Canberra, which is that it's all China that's done the changing. And I think China has done some changing, but it's hard for me to compare speeches that Morrison made in 2019 with what he did just less than a year later, and see that the Australian in Canberra, there hadn't been change as well. So I'm glad that my sense was not.
Well, your thesis is just to add, James. If you said you wanted it free flowing, so it was China that changed 2012 with the leadership. Then 2014, we started to see it became very apparent And those of us in business reflected on that, and we saw lots of investment changes started to take place around 2014. But the changes in the rhetoric of the Chinese for some of the actions that we took under Turnbull, and his final speech as Prime Minister was much more conciliatory, you might recall.
I do.
And so it is China changed again, and so we reflected that change by we changing. Now, we're in an awkward position. The Japanese and the Koreans, as Eleanor points out, have hedged somewhat more diplomatically successfully than we have, and they've got much more at stake in terms of the size of economy and size of trade that they have. We're just proportionally much higher than anybody else for a country of 26 million. Yep. So we have a challenge, and my focus and my mantra has always been principled realism, i.e. we protect and understand our values of freedom, et cetera, and we embrace those. But principled realism means you have to reflect on the fact that you're a trading nation. So sure. I wear a hat for business. I don't wear a hat for politics. I wear a hat for business, which I think will always have a vested interest in having engagement at a sensible level. And we don't give up on diplomacy, and we look for ways to keep dialogues going. The avoidance of I just saw a comment this morning from the Foreign Minister. Where is it? This quite surprised me. The potential of a new Cold War. They have fresh concerns as Blinken arrives, and the no limits friendship treaty between China and Russia. There's a threat posed by China to the Indo-Pacific. It's enhanced. The rhetoric is getting quite concerning to business. Yep. It's getting quite concerning to business as we enter into a political fray here at a time when there's so much uncertainty globally.
Okay, thanks, Warwick. All right, let's start turning now our attention forward somewhat. Dr. Chen, if I can go back to you, as we look ahead this year, we've got the 2 sessions and the Party Congress. Many commentators, we're at the Party Congress, of course, it's expected that President Xi will be formally given that 3rd term as China's president. Many commentators will argue that a Marxist-Leninist worldview sees history in a very deterministic ways. I mean, I think many of our audience would be familiar with Chinese government officials from Xi down talking about China's development being, quote, an inevitable historical trend, close quote. US-China strategic competition, that appears structural. So both in and outside of China, there are frames and forces that look to me to support significant continuity, path dependence. I read a comment from Orville Schell yesterday, in fact, he's a well-known US sinologist who was pointing to analysis that contended China's system was incapable of, quote, reform. But by reform, it seemed to me that what he meant was become more like us. And so I do wonder whether in China's mind it can reform, but that doesn't mean it's going to become like us. So should we project the changes in China's politics that we've seen over, say, the last 5 years forward in time? Or are we, in your view, just as likely to be surprised by the twists and turns that Beijing might take in the next few years? Feel free to be brave and offer some non-consensus forecasts if you'd like.
I like this discussion about reform. I agree with you. If reform means democratization, a democratic change, then I don't think I'd hate to predict, but I don't think that's what we are going to see in 5 years. But if we think about change as just impartial reforms, this is what has always been happening in Chinese politics. Just let me put my thoughts together, right? So like, take the Chinese Communist Party, for example. I think a lot of people outside China thinking about the Chinese Communist Party kind of conveniently forget that this Chinese Communist Party nowadays that we see is very different from the Chinese Communist Party that came into the picture of Chinese politics in 1921 and came to power in 1949. This is a political force which has successfully managed to transfer itself from a revolutionary party whose major goal was to overturn the rule of its rival, which is the KMT, the Kuomintang. and to establish its own rule into a ruling party whose major goal now is to control and maintain power, right? So in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party came into power, its self-definition was the Chinese Communist Party is the vanguard of the proletariat. Nowadays, I don't know if people actually are familiar with the Chinese Communist Party's constitution, but if you have a chance, maybe I think a comparative reading would be quite interesting, because nowadays the self-definition of the Chinese Communist Party is quite a bit of a mouthful. The Chinese Communist Party is now the vanguard both of the Chinese working class as well as of the Chinese people and the Chinese nation. And also it represents China's advanced productive force, the orientation of China's advanced culture, and the fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. It's really abstract ideas, but I think the point to stress here is just this change of the Chinese Communist Party's self-definition shows a kind of continuing effort to reform in order to justify a market-oriented economy's existence, as well as to stay for itself to stay connected with a very diverse and very dynamic society. So I think we can come back to this a little bit later, right? What we are seeing here, I agree with a lot of scholars who call it capitalism without democracy, but I wouldn't say it's capitalism without political reform. It's a lot of internal reform. Actually, we have seen all these days, things such as village elections being introduced in the 1990s, institutionalization of the decision-making process, the criteria of the Chinese Communist Party's elite recruitment, and also its relationship with society. All these things have been changing, and these are all results of reform. So I think I've said it right. This reform, like impartial, limited political reform.
Thanks, Dr. Chen.
In fact, I'm sorry, if I could just interject. I agree very much about the world needs to update its view about the Chinese Communist Party as a party. I agree very much with this part of Dr. Chen's arguments. Actually, I would go one step further, just very quickly. I would imagine the Chinese Communist Party these days is more about being Chinese than communist. It's no longer a political party in the traditional sense. Its concerns is much less about staying in power than about leading China. If indeed we believe it's Xi's ideal and all of the Communist Party leadership's ideal that their most important goal is to restore China to its due role in the world, then it's not about uniting the working class of the whole world. It's about navigating China through all the big political, economic challenges of today's world to its rightful place. Well, where this rightful place is, of course, it's very much debatable even within China, without China, but it's much less a political party in the traditional sense. It's not a party anymore. If it's 7% of the whole country's population, then it's not a political party. It's a force. It doesn't need to compete within China with anybody else. So it's not a party. It's an elite government force, elite governing force. It's not elected. It's already there, and it's not so much worried about losing power than about the rest of the world, I think.
Okay, thanks, Wang Feng. Look, I might just stick with you if that's okay. Again, I'm taking advantage of the fact that you're not in Australia because I want that sort of one step removed perspective. Many commentators in Australia, and I suspect in Washington as well, will say that under Xi, Beijing has become less self-reflective and externally aware. Its capacity to recognise its own mistakes and the costs associated with some of the recent paths it's been taking, and potentially change course. That awareness has been reduced, in essence, because no one wants to criticise the leader or deliver bad news. In contrast, they often say that the great strengths of liberal democracy is the practice of freedom of speech and an open context of ideas, because that's what generates a capacity for changing paths and renewal. Mind you, in China, what I often hear is almost the polar opposite. What I will hear there is it's China's system of government that pays attention to the demands of society, and it's able to be flexible and adapt to the needs of the day. In contrast, vested interests, social polarization, etc., in the West, means it's unable to take decisive and necessary decisions for the good of society as a whole. How accurately do you think Beijing is reading developments at home and abroad these days? I mean, should we expect major policy miscalculations from Beijing because it's lacking some self-awareness or awareness of the outside world?
I think that is indeed the mechanism of receiving signals and feedback from the outside world, from within China domestically, and translating all this feedback into next step policy actions or policy adjustments. That's indeed one of the biggest challenges of today's, Communist Party, of today's Chinese government. Freedom of speech, of course, there's no denying, has very much dwindled in China these days, and that's a big challenge, especially for people of my profession. But the argument that there's no more working channels from the Communist Party to get real data, get real information about what is being said about China, within China, what is being done about China, outside of China, I think that's also very oversimplistic. Take all the debates these days, the hottest debates in China not today, not necessarily about Eileen Gu or the Winter Olympics. The hottest debate in China today, I would say, is about this woman, slave woman who was chained into a pigsty by this peasant family, was abused for 8 years, many years, given birth to 8 children. The plight of this one woman overshadowed anything else in China, even during the Chinese Spring Festival, the Chinese New Year. That says something about how national discourse is being conducted about important issues. And the government, of course, censored a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the discussion, but in the end, it still managed to bubble to the surface. And I'm afraid it's going to lead to some crackdowns and local government crackdowns in this particular case. So it's the whole feedback process and the decision-making process has become a lot complex, a lot intransparent, but it's still working. And to the outside world, this is very confusing. But I think that's why we need to put a lot of more research into how feedback signals are being given to the party, to the leadership, and how they are basing their policies upon these. It's a very interesting area of study, which is not getting enough attention these days.
Thanks, Wangfeng. I just, when you were talking, I was just remembering a piece of research I read last week, which just documented how in Australia, how overwhelmingly America and UK-centred Australian media outlets were, generally sidelining China and Southeast Asia. But I guess also what you're saying is that even when we do cover China, the angles that it gets covered from, such as Eileen Gu, for example, the Beijing Winter Olympics, they're often being covered in very specific frames that could be wildly different to the dominant frames that are being discussed in China itself. So I think that's an important thing for all of us to keep in mind as well. Thank you. Okay, Warwick, I'm just going to go to you with one more forward-looking question. Then I see there's a couple questions from the audience, but let me go to you first. Well, Xi Jinping may not be going anywhere this year, but Australia's Prime Minister might. We've got a federal election coming up, and it does raise the question, which you've already touched on, whether the view of Beijing or how to manage Australia-China relations might change. Now, Anthony Albanese, the leader of the opposition, has been pretty clear on this point. Let me quote from him just a week or so ago. He said, quote, "I think the starting point is that whoever's in government, it will be a difficult relationship. It will be difficult because the posture of China has changed. I don't blame the government and never have for the current circumstances. One thing I would hope for, though, is that you can have an Australian policy that would be exactly the same on the Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on the South China Sea, on human rights, but still have an economic relationship that the Howard government had, and that is important to the region," closed quote. Now, Warwick, that last bit is the rub, isn't it? I mean, Albanese has said he wants to keep domestic politics out of the China relationship. Penny Wong, the Shadow Foreign Minister, has said she'll lead with diplomacy, putting DFAT back in charge of managing the China relationship, and so on. But Warwick, is it your sense that that shift will be enough, or might be enough, to put a flaw in, at least a flaw in the Canberra-Beijing relationship, and maybe, just maybe, chart a more positive course? Or is it simply the case, and I've heard this said, in fact, I think this is probably the dominant view in Australia, that nowadays Australia's interests and values are just so deeply and fundamentally different to China's that it is inevitable that Australian policies and public statements will move in a direction that China just cannot live with? Warwick, what's your sense?
I didn't find anything of major exception to what the opposition leader said. To engage in diplomacy, to avoid catastrophe, but we are united in broadly the principles that we adhere to, and all of the key issues. Political interference legislation was jointly passed. Approach to Huawei was jointly agreed to. So the 14 so-called 14 points from the very vigorous China embassy was a pushback point for everybody. It was a terrible overreach by China, yet another own kicked goal. So I didn't find anything exceptional. When he commented about the new Chinese ambassador that's arrived, a highly professional ambassador who's currently doing his official rounds in Canberra, offered some opportunity for discussion. I think everybody, certainly in business, welcomed that, because we just had a major business dialogue a couple of weeks prior with the key Australian exporters and the key China companies. So I didn't find it exceptional. The point is, though, that we can't go back to where we were. It's a new reality. And as I said at the beginning, the global fault lines are bigger and more complex now than we've seen for a long, long time. So, but we have to be realistic. We can be principled, rapid in values, but we can be principled. And so I don't think we want provocative activity from either side during this campaign. I was in Canberra for a long time. There's 8 key electorates that have very large Chinese influence. Both political parties are aware of that. There's no advantage to anyone. And given that we've had 50 years of relationships, we're different countries and different cultures, but we've had a track record that's been very successful. It just doesn't turn over overnight. I think that the media has pushed some of these issues. Why wouldn't they? I'm in the media too, but as an operator. So, James, I don't really know if it answers your question, but our nation is best served by recognising that since establishment, we've been a trading nation. We always will be. Therein lies our wealth and our growth and our prosperity. Our current largest trading partner by a very, very large extent. And you just quoted the figures of 177 billion, up by 21%. The reality of the situation is not lost on even short-focused political classes in Canberra. It's not always the same actually in the States, across Australia. So let's try to keep it in balance. That's what I argue from the Business Council. Let's keep this in balance. Let the rhetoric be kept in balance. Let some of the think tanks keep it in balance. And to hear think tanks talk about business as craven is completely irresponsible. They're not. And neither are think tanks craven in their views. So there needs to be some maturity here.
Thanks, Warwick. Okay, let me go to a couple of questions now. We are running out of time, so I'd ask our panel to keep the responses as crisp as they could be. Warwick, can I ask just a quick comment from you on this one? Glenda Corporal, who you and I both know, she says, can the new ambassador make a difference? And I know Eleanor Collinson in her brief does particularly home in on one quote from the new ambassador, Xiao, where he says he's looking forward to talking with the Australian government and friends to jointly push the Australia-China relationship. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but it is nice to see that word jointly. So just quickly, Warwick, do you think a new Chinese ambassador can make much difference?
Well, look, Glenda's a very, very astute and long-term commentator and observer of these relationships, and she would know that some of the changes to address these difficulties have to come from the top. So from an ambassador, from our foreign ministers, from our ambassadors, those sentiments, when expressed, are to be welcomed, and they do provide the opportunity for platform. It's not as though this is a relationship we've just found. This has been going for 50 years.
Yep.
You don't throw it away. You work on it, you deal with the realities of the new situation, both politically in our country and in China, and you work your way forward. So, yes, Glenda, I think, is right. The ambassador, I am told, is in the middle of his official presentations to department and agencies. He goes around to everyone and sees everyone. When they're done, he starts to then go and talk to people like you and I, James, that sit on the periphery but are very, very interested observers and can add some value to his thinking and to those people that we interlocute with. So we will see him. He's a very professional. He's a senior person, having run Indonesia for China. He comes with a very deep professional and well-regarded. He gets promoted into this role to Australia. It's a highly regarded post now by China. So I think there's chance to have dialogue. It won't matter who's the Prime Minister or who's the Foreign Minister or the Trade Minister. The Japanese and Koreans give us some examples. If you look at some of the work that Glenda and you people did, some of the trade that we've been slammed shut is gone to those that compete against us, the Canadians and the US. So it's a movable situation. Stay flexible, stay engaged with diplomacy, stay engaged with all the connections that you have, and build on those and work our way forward sensibly.
Okay, thanks. I'll go to Wang Feng with a question, then to you, Dr. Chen, next. Wang Feng, this question is from Toby Graham, who is based in Shanghai, if I remember rightly. He says, what do you think about the proposition that staying in power is the means? So we always talk about the Chinese Communist Party is obsessed with staying in power, but Toby wonders, in the Chinese Communist Party's mind, it's not just about staying in power, is it? It's actually about delivering a result too. I mean, how focused do you see the Chinese Communist Party is on producing that result that gives them the legitimacy?
Right. I think we touched on this earlier. In my opinion, it's not so much about staying in power when you're so much ingrained into everything the nation is doing, into every organization, into even the national consciousness. When you have firmly set your goal as restoring China to its rightful place in history or in the world, then it's not so much about staying in power. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't really have to worry that much about staying in power as long as there's still a China. There's still a China with a growing economy, maintain its current level of living standards for the people. It's about, indeed, as you said, delivering that dream, that Chinese dream, whatever that rightful place is. It's about getting it done before a disastrous world war strikes China off that course. I think that's the biggest challenge. That's the one job that the Chinese Communist Party is entrusting itself in doing these days.
Okay, thanks, Wang Feng. Dr. Chen, I'd like to now ask you a question. This is from Wan Chen. It's a tough question. I should warn you, but I would like to hear your take on it. He asked any of the panelists, but I'll put this one to you, Dr. Chen. Would you please explain, unlike Australia, why do Japan and South Korea not worsen their relationship with China? Now, I think some people may say, well, hang on, the relationship between China and Japan has certainly gotten a lot more challenging over the last year, but Australia still does seem to be a bit of an outlier. What do you think other countries are doing that is different to Australia that might be contributing to Australia being an outlier?
Wow, this is indeed a very tough question. Let me try. I think there are probably other quite a few factors which might be able to explain this. I think the different kind of historical and cultural connections between these East Asian neighbors and geographical proximity, that could be another thing. Because I'm not really an international relations expert, my expertise is Chinese politics. I think really when we try to understand China's relationship with Australia or China's relationship with Japan, is the same, right? What we should understand is often the foreign policy making is driven by domestic needs. Particularly in this case, I think it's fairly obvious in every country, their foreign policy making is driven by this country's own national interests. But in the case of China-Australia relationship, which we often talk about, I think one thing that people forget frequently is China's so-called Australia policy is often not about Australia. It's frequently not about Australia, it's about China itself. I think I'll just stop here.
Yeah, right. So that's important, isn't it? Because so when China's thinking about Japan or Korea, again, those domestic factors that come into play are different to those that come into play when China itself is thinking about Australia. Okay, thank you very much. Look, we are rapidly running out of time. I'm almost hesitant to go to one more question, but look, Dr. Chen, I'll just stick with you for this last question. What is one thing you'd like our audience to finish this webinar thinking more about? What's the one thing that you think often gets missed in Australia's China debate?
I think it's really important to get China right, to understand what this system is and how this system works. That's the foundation for anyone to really understand how the bilateral, even trilateral relationship should go, in which direction it should move. I just want to say, when we talk about China, China is really not a monolithic unity. The Chinese Communist Party, as Wang Feng was saying, is not a monolithic unity as well. Instead, often we are ignoring that this is a complicated hierarchical system which incorporates very different agendas, very different interests at very different levels. So we have policy orientations coming from the national level, then it all depends on the local levels to implement, right? Now we have at local levels, different local governments competing with each other, and leaders matter, but perhaps not matter very much, but individual leaders' personal agenda and political aspiration also matter. So all these things together, right, I think the conflict, internal conflict, cooperation, different forces, all these things matter in Chinese politics. It's probably a difficult system to figure out, but it's an important system to figure out.
Yeah, but at least let's make an effort to understand China on China's terms, right? I mean, I just think that's a key thing to keep in mind. Even as a boring economist, that often comes back, that often frames the way I think about it as well, understanding China or thinking about China on China's terms. And by that, well, I'm not talking about thinking things in terms of the Chinese Communist Party, but embracing all of that whole of society complexity that you're talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Understanding China on China's terms. Okay, look, I would actually love to hear from Wang Feng and Warwick for a final comment, but we have run out of time. So look, Amy, I'm going to throw back to you. I always knew this would be a challenge given the big picture topics we were talking about today, but I think I'm going to have to wrap it up there. Back to you, Amy.
Thanks, James. And thank you to Dr. Minglu Chen, the Honourable Warwick Smith and Mr. Wang Feng for today's discussion. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it so that we can make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. The discussion today will also be available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to all our speakers and our attendees. See you next time.